these international bodies, there remain worse problems that are in fact getting worse rather than being resolved. The inequalities across the world, the unchallenged aggression by some states. When one state, we're not talking about wars here. Wars have always happened, and unfortunately will continue to take place. I hope not for too long. What we're talking about here is unilateral aggression, when one state chooses to invade another one, and the international community, the international bodies, the international organizations that we are led to believe that they will stop this, that they will maintain peace, fail to stop it, fail to prevent it, and fail to help to remedy the consequences. And when an international court wants to open an investigation, for example, into the possible crimes committed by one invading country to another, in the latest case of the United States of America invading Afghanistan, the president of the most powerful country in the world starts to threaten the judges, and the international community, the states, the bodies, the international bodies, all they can do is condemn. They can't even stop this powerful politician from threatening judges who want just to investigate. Now, there might have been no crimes, I doubt it, but it's just an investigation. Brothers and sisters, in the economical aspect, there are growing debts, not for individuals, but for nations, including the most powerful nations of the world. In summary, and I invite every single one of the participants to revisit the state of our world, things are not working. And the COVID-19 pandemic was just another example of how this system, this world order, is not serving the purpose it was set out to achieve. Why is this important? Why was this introduction important? Well, because it's time to look for an alternative. It's time to re-examine this and talk about the principles. The principles of a current world order, politically, economically, is a self-centric, has self-centric foundations. It is a person-centric paradigm, person-centric system. And what we are calling for is a God-centric system, a system that rests on the foundation of God-centricity. And that's why we're talking now, even though we have to do it all the time, but now, more than any other time, it is very important to revisit these very early discussions. Does the world have a creator? And if so, what are his attributes? Can we conclude that the world has a creator using a rational approach? And if we establish that, then the second part of the discussion, and I appreciate I'm jumping, will be who are the guides that would help us to understand the principles and the details of this God-centric paradigm. And in this case, it would be Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. And can we approach this discussion from a Quranic perspective and Quranic perspective alone? Because within the Muslim Ummah, there has always been a discussion about whether this answer can be answered from the Quran and from the Quran alone. So a God-centric system, a God-centric model. The rational approach, which we will use to prove the existence of God, has certain distinguishing features from other approaches, and all other approaches are respected, but this one is unique, and you will find out why. Amongst the reasons why it is unique is that the rational foundations, the rational principles that we use, the laws of logic, are very early and essential principles that are embedded within the human intellect, that simply it makes sense to everyone who chooses to use them. Now, maybe we don't pay attention to them. We use them every day, but applying them to this very important discussion of the existence of a creator or not is something that not many people probably have engaged in, or have engaged in and then they couldn't pursue the discussion further or the research further because of misinformation. And here I would like this opportunity to remind myself and to remind all the respected audience of the importance of studying these matters, studying them with the help of a teacher, a specialist. I myself, on the topic of rational existence of God, I've attended lessons. They date back to 2001, 2002, just before I started my university degree with Sheikh Hussein al-Asadi here in London. And for the second topic, about Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam from the Quran, I attended lessons with Samahat Sayyid Sami Badri. So this is a reminder for all of us to seize the opportunity, especially with this whole virtual world that we are using. The opportunities are quite few. You may not have enough time in the future to do this, so use the opportunity and make the most out of it. So, logic, rationality, everyone can understand them, and the one other advantage of using this rational approach as opposed to the scientific approach, even though the scientific approach rests on rationality, but we're just using the rational approach now, that is that these rules, these basic principles do not change with time. These basic principles do not change with time. So these arguments, you can use them in the 21st century, and you could have used them in the 6th century, and so on. Because logic, rationality does not change. Now, the final conclusion about the Creator will have those three attributes. I hope everyone can see the screen. Using the rational approach, we will come to the conclusion that the world, the existence around us, must have had a creator who could have only been completely independent, absolutely independent, could have only been independent. And I would like you to remember these three traits, these three descriptions, these three attributes. Independent, limitless, has no borders and no limits, and he is the source of all perfection. So independent, which is the most important trait, limitless, and he is the source of absolute perfection. And you will see that amongst the most famous chapters in the Quran has those three attributes all combined together, mentioned together. We're starting with the first rule, the first principle, the law, the principle of causality. That for every event, for every action, there has to be a cause. Now, I appreciate this you might have read this or come across it with a different terminology. People could have mentioned to you in a discussion that for everything there's a cause. No, not for everything there's a cause. For every event, for every action, there's a cause. And maybe that's what people mean, but the terminology is very, very important here. And the most basic example, that if you place a glass of water on the edge of a table, it will never move on its own. The event or the action of the glass falling, moving, needs a cause. And I appreciate that we're doing this virtually over the internet. And if you have any questions, just like Muntada said, just put your hand and then I will elaborate. You don't have to wait until we finish. So causality, for every event, for every action to take place, there has to be a cause that has preceded it. Now, if you imagine our world, June 2020, yesterday, the week before, the month before, all these events led to the events of today. So all the events and the actions of today essentially depend on the events and the actions of last week, last month, last year, last century, last millennium, and so on. And you had the first one, you needed the first one to take place for it to lead to the events of today. So all the events, all the actions, even our existence today here, depends on the preceding ones. And that's just common sense. And the picture of the domino pieces set together is just one way of demonstrating that the last domino piece, you can take it as representing today's events. It all depends on the ones preceding it. Now, if you go back in time, if you go back and follow this row of domino pieces, that's called regression. You're going back in time. Now, there are two options. Either this regression is finite, i.e. it stops at some point, or it just continues forever backwards, forever back in time, forever regressing backwards. So either there's a set number of pieces or an infinite number of pieces. Set number of events, that the first one took place, it led to the ones today, or an infinite number of events. So the regression is either infinite or it had a starting point. In philosophy, that's based on rationality, because some aspects of philosophy is not based on rationality. But in philosophy that's based on rationality, the second principle is, the first principle that we learned about was causality. For every event there's a cause. This is the second principle, that infinite regression of events is false, of events that depend on each other. False. It doesn't lead to an event. Now, if you think about it, if the set of domino pieces has got a fixed number, 1 billion, and today's event is event number 1 billion, you need the first piece to fall, year 1, for all of them to follow until today's year. But if you go back an infinite number of years, an infinite number of domino pieces, at any point you stop and you want that piece to fall to cause the event of today, eventually, that piece will say, I need the piece before me to fall. And if you go further back, you stop at any point, because it was the proposed regression is infinite. No matter how far you go back, one piece will always say, I need the piece that was before me to fall. Eventually, no piece would fall. Not a single piece of domino will fall. no event will take place. Another way of describing it is they say, well, if you imagine a row of people standing, the last one of them standing at the door, and that person will say, I will only go through the door if the person before me gives me a push. If there is if there's a finite, specific number of people, person number one starts the push, eventually the last person will get through the door. If there's an infinite number of people, that person at the door will not go through, because you will continue to go back waiting for someone to start the push, and it's an infinite regression. So infinite regression is false of events that depend on each other. It can't happen. Today we do have a world. There are events. So that regression couldn't have been infinite. It must have stopped and started at some point. Now, the question is, what was there at the starting point? Who or what pushed the first piece of domino? If that thing or that one that started it all was just another domino piece, something similar to our world, well, you say, that's you've just added another piece. And the question is valid. Who pushed that first piece? Who started the first event? Because the first rational law was, for every action, for every event, there's a cause. You've just added yet another domino piece. Tell me, who pushed that one? And you might have heard this approach when someone asks the wrong question by saying, who created God? Now that question is a false question. Why? Because no one probably has discussed with that individual these rational principles in order. And it will become apparent why this question is wrong. Now, so what was their year zero? First event. If it was something similar to the world, it's another domino piece. The question is still valid. Who started it? Who pushed it? Because our world does exist today and it's a reality, we can only conclude, process of elimination, we can only conclude that the thing or the one that started it all couldn't have been something similar to our world. Something different. Different, remember this. Something, someone different to our world. Otherwise, it would have been just another domino piece. Different to the rest of the world. Different, remember this key word. The one who started it all, who started the world, who started the first action and continues obviously to sustain the rest of it, the rest of the world, is different to our world. And the first way in which it is different, the first aspect, like you see in this picture now with the great, obviously, you have to forgive me for proposing this, but just like you see that the domino pieces, the hand pushes it, for example, in this picture, just an example, the first cause must have been something different. And the first aspect of how it was different is that it could not have been dependent on anything else. Everything in our world is dependent on something. The first cause could have only been an independent entity. Absolutely independent. Otherwise, that question is applied yet again. Who started it? You can't keep going back like this because infinite regression is false. You can only stop at one point and say it started from this point. Infinite regression doesn't lead to June 2020. Finite regression, yes. Who started it all? Someone who was independent, absolutely independent. Depends on nothing else, absolutely nothing. For some of you, it's probably starting to become clear why the question of who created God is a false question, rationally. Because if by God you mean the first cause, well, rationally the first cause can only be independent. So you asking or someone proposing the question of who created it is a false question. First attribute, if you remember the three that we stated at the beginning: independent, limitless, and absolute perfection. This is the first one, absolutely independent. I don't want to jump to the second aspect without it being clear to the audience. If anyone's got any questions, just raise your hand, please, and we'll pause and discuss. Maybe it's making sense. But if you do have a question, please just raise your hand, and then we'll discuss it. So the first cause could have only been an independent entity. Absolutely independent, nothing before it. Now, the consequences of being independent, absolutely independent, is that this entity, the first cause, can't have borders, can't have limits, can't have a shape. Why? Because if you propose any shape, limit, borders for him, because clearly he's intelligent, and because he created our world and he designed our world, so it's fair at this point to refer to him as an intelligent, higher being who is absolutely independent. If you propose any three-dimensional form for him, any borders, then the question is, well, who set these borders? Who decided on these borders? And these borders represent limits. And if someone has limits, then that being depends on these limits to exist in that particular shape or form. If you set borders, limits for a room, chair, car, a body, a tree, then that tree, that room, that car, that body depends to exist on these limits. If you change them, that entity will change. It will become something different, either a bigger entity, a bigger tree, a bigger car, a different room now, a different tree, a different car. So limits, borders, they represent something that being depends on to exist in that particular format. And because we've established that the first cause, the creator of the world, cannot be dependent on anything, including these limits, the one conclusion is he could have only been limitless. He could have only been limitless. Someone with no limits at all. And the appropriate description is absolute. Absolute. He could have only been absolute. So, an independent being, the cause of everything, he's limitless, he's absolute, and he caused everything to exist, to take place. So he has that limitless ability, limitless power, limitless knowledge, limitless existence. Now, another aspect that I have to mention is the principle of the unity between his essence and his attributes. We are not proposing that this higher being, the creator of the world, is a being that exists and he has attributes. He has knowledge, he has wisdom, he has power. If you propose that, then he becomes a complex being of several parts, i.e. you have him, you have his knowledge, you have his power, you have his wisdom, you have his, and so on. We're not proposing that. That proposal is not valid. Why? Because if you propose this complex format, he becomes a being that depends on these parts to come together to exist. So basically he depends on his parts. And he can't depend on anything. He could have only been independent to be able to cause our world and create it. So we're left with one possibility, that his existence is simple. There is unity between his essence that we can't comprehend because it's something without limits, and it can't be three-dimensional. There is unity between his essence and his attributes. So his presence is infinite, is absolute. His knowledge, his wisdom, his power can only be this way. So an independent, higher being, cause of everything, has everything, he's absolute, he's limitless. Having no limits to your attributes, to your perfection, then you can only be the absolute perfection. So the creator of our world, respected audience, I'm just looking at the time to see how long it took us to come to this conclusion. I think it's about probably 25 or 30 minutes. The creator of our world, the first cause, God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, rationally speaking, using no religious text, using only a rational approach, using causality and infinite regression being false, combining them together, you come to the first conclusion of the first attribute, and then you build on it. You just have to put these thoughts in rational, logical order, and you reach this conclusion. It doesn't take that long, but it takes a session like this to do it. One lecture, one discussion, a bit of focus. Some of you might have come across this in a different way, or probably wondering that if it makes so much sense, why isn't the rest of the world why do they talk about this? It's so easy. Anyway, inshallah, during the discussion we may discuss why there's so many distractions in the current world that we live in. So anyhow, higher being, independent, absolute perfection. And here I could only remind the audience of Surah At-Tawheed. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Qul huwa Allahu ahad. Ahad is different from wahid. Wahid in Arabic. Wahid is one that you could have two and three beyond the one. In Arabic, if you say wahid, then you're expected to say, well, what about ithnan, thalatha? What about two and three? But when you say ahad, then there's only one, the one. قل هو الله أحد, الله الصمد. Samad in Arabic has two possible meanings. Either the one that has no no inside, لا جوف له, doesn't have a jawf, an inside, i.e. it can't be three-dimensional. He exists, but he can't be three-dimensional, doesn't have a body, which is essentially the ultimate conclusion of the first attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is being independent. The second meaning of Samad is the one that everyone depends on, because he is absolutely independent. Everyone depends on. Yasmad ilayh means depends on him. So, قل هو الله أحد, this surah of the Quran, this chapter was amongst the most beloved chapters of the Quran to Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib. And in fact, in history we have a story to say that some of the companions who accompanied Imam Ali in a trip outside Medina, this is during the time of the Prophet, they prayed obviously behind him, Jama'ah, and in every salah he used to recite this surah, Surah Al-Samad, Surah Al-Tawheed. And they came back to the Prophet and they mentioned it, maybe in complaining that Imam Ali only read this verse, this chapter of the Quran. The Prophet at that point made a recommendation that we are highly recommended to pray it. And in fact, we are highly encouraged to have no one day of salah without reciting it at least once in our salah. Because it's there, it has the meanings of the first attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the deciding attribute, the being independent, being samad. And it's the samad that has no inside, that everyone depends on, that from it you can build on to understand, not the nature of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but to understand the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his necessity. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. There's nothing like him because he's absolute perfection. I think I will stop here, and I'm grateful for your patience, and inshallah it's time we take some questions. Next discussion we'll probably talk about an important attribute, which is justice, and from there we'll move to the life after death topic. And then once we finish that, we will start the second topic, which is Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam from the Quran. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala Muhammadin wa alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. I'm just going to check my messages in case someone send me a message. I think Brother Muntala, you need to unmute yourself because I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'd just like to thank you for your lovely introduction and your talk as well, and just for allowing us to open our eyes on fundamental questions. And like you rightly said, these are questions that have been asked for centuries and will be asked after our lifespans as well. I have a question here from a brother, so I'm going to ask to unmute, and please, Brother Kazim, ask your question.
Thank you, Brother Munsi. Assalamu alaikum, Sayyid. Inshallah, you're well. Thank you very much for the talk. Is my voice clear, by the way?
Yes, it is.
Okay.